Hello and welcome to our NAP. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, and I'm Irina Ryshkova, your nonprofit auditor. Let's talk today about how we auditors test net assets, what specifically we're looking for, and what information we're asking from client. I hope that this information will help bookkeepers, management, and overall folks who involved in maintaining books and proper records for nonprofit to know what information needs to be retained, what needs to be looked at and analyzed. Okay, let's start. Testing of net assets. As you know, net assets can be categorized in nonprofits as a net assets with donor restrictions and net assets without donor restrictions. So when we concentrate on the testing net assets, we're primarily looking at the net assets with donor restrictions. And we do look in the net assets without donor restrictions, which I will talk a little bit about later. But pretty much net assets without donor restrictions, it's residual from overall net assets. Therefore, our job as auditors, because we need to be more conservative, make sure that the nonprofit properly identified net assets that have donor restrictions. Why is that critical? Because donor restrictions come from the outside, not within the organization. They come from the donors, and the donor's wish needs to be properly accounted for. Because nonprofits, specifically 501c3 public charity, they supported by public, and if the public donors impose the restrictions on the funds, they need to be properly accounted and presented. As you know, the donor wish comes typically from grant agreements. In order for us as auditors to identify if there is any restriction, we need to see that restrictions come from a donor. Unfortunately, very often we receive response from the client that says, we did not have any communication with the donor, money just appeared in the bank. Could be, yes, but not very common. At least some communication from the donor was present. So typically for the grants, we need to see a grant letter, or if there is no grant letter, donor can write something on a check, or if there is no writing in a check, if it was a wire, donor can indicate restriction in the communication, either phone communication, email communication, text communication. Because for auditors, we need to obtain reasonable support. It is highly recommended for nonprofit. If there is no communication from the donor in writing, where the funds are restricted, make sure that you do initiate some memo, documentation, or email writing to the client just to thank the client for the restricted donation and indicate what it was restricted for. One way or another, there has to be some documentation about restrictions of the funds. Therefore, when we start testing net assets with donor restrictions, we ask the net asset schedule. What is it? When we say net assets with donor restriction schedule, we need to see the beginning balance of restricted net assets in the beginning of the year. Then if there were any additions during the year that the organization received with a restriction from the donor, then if any funds were released, meaning that restriction was met, and the ending balance with net assets with donor restrictions. That net ending balance have to agree to your net assets with donor restrictions on a balance sheet. Once we know that it agrees to the schedule, your general ledger with the schedule, we looked at your schedule. And we see the beginning balance, they also agree with the prior year schedule. Now our job is to test additions to net assets with donor restrictions. And as I mentioned before, what we do, we ask for the grant letters or any communication that you had with the donor that indicates a restriction. Nowadays, a lot of communications happens electronically. There is no paper grant. Very often, nonprofit needs to go online, apply for the grant, and get a congratulation letter that your grant has been approved. It's a nonprofit responsibility to download the copy of the grant, because we as an auditors needs to verify that there is no restriction on the grant. Again, sometimes when the nonprofit applied for the grant and received the grant, the portal will close at some time and you cannot download the grant later on. If we audit and the nonprofit does not have a grant letter, we will ask you to go back to the donor and ask for the grant letter. So make sure that every donation is supported by grant, because you need to substantiate your treatment of the grant as restricted or non-restricted. Also, grant letters has a lot of important information for us and for bookkeepers that indicate date of promise, that indicates cutoff, restriction, or maybe grant can be conditional. And if it's conditional grant, it should not have been even recorded. Therefore, we cannot just simply rely on a schedule and say, yes, we agree with the client, it's a restricted grant. We need to independently to come to that conclusion. You as a nonprofit was involved in a grant negotiation, talking to the donor, you know the donor intent, and we respect it, but our job as auditors to verify that your understanding of the grant and the treatment of the grant is correct. Therefore, we hear what you're saying, but we need to have external verification from the donor that its donation is unrestricted or restricted, not conditional or conditional, if it's restricted by time, by purpose, so and so forth. So therefore, highly advisable, make sure that all grant letters are kept. I know nonprofits get excited once they're approved for the grant, but they need to make sure that they download the grant letter and also give a copy to bookkeepers so they know how to treat that grant from accounting standpoint, so they understand the nature of the grant. That's probably one of the most common mistakes that we encounter. Then we see if the restrictions is by purpose or by time. Under general GAAP, there's two types of restrictions, purpose or time. Some grants can be restricted for both purpose and time, and on the schedule it will be presented it's restricted either by purpose or by time. And also on a statement of financial position on a balance sheet, restricted net assets are separate from net assets without donor restrictions. That's how we test net assets with donor restrictions. Additionally, we do perform testing for net assets without the donor restrictions, specifically related to quasi-endowment funds, if the board designates some money for specific purpose and they create quasi-endowment funds. So typically, how it happens, that's typically supported by minutes of the board of directors, and board of directors need to review their quasi-endowment funds annually and confirm that there's still endowment and what is amount in endowment. And because it's internally restricted funds, board has a power to unrestrict them. Therefore, their will to continue to have these funds in quasi-endowment funds or designated funds needs to be documented in the minutes of the board of directors. We also need to know the purpose why they are designated in a specific fund, and a policy of spending this money or spending the interest and dividends and any earnings that fund makes. And that's as I mentioned before, residual amount of net assets, it will become from the rest of the testing of revenue and expenses. But that's what we typically look when we're testing net assets with donor restrictions. Thank you so much. Hopefully that was useful, and looking forward to see you for our next nap. Be safe.